Welcome to Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan, and we are broadcasting live on June 11th from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. Today on the show, we're going to hear from the Gaza Strip from a Palestinian man whose family has been separated and they're trying to find a way out. That's coming up later in the show. But first up, we're going to hear an intriguing story of spying, criminal trials, and a peace process, and it all has a Tampa Bay connection. Our guest joining us by Zoom right now is Abdon Polish, who is a staff writer for the Tampa Tribune and other outlets. In this interview, we're going to learn about how a chance encounter at a Pinellas County beach bar is connected to enduring peace in Ireland. So I want to welcome you to Tuesday Cafe, Abdon.
Great to be here, Sean. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. And before we get into the story about Ireland, why don't you tell us about your time at the Tampa Tribune and what you're up to now?
Sure. Now, I worked at the Tampa Tribune for about 5 years in the 90s. It was a great time. You know, the war was going great between the Tampa Tribune and the St. Pete Times. There was great journalism going from both sides. I did a lot of my time out of Clearwater, covering the crazy stuff going on the beach. They settled everything with the pass there, Dunedin Pass. Wild stories. I used to hang out here at the Harp and Thistle Pub on St. Pete Beach. I hope everybody listening here had a chance to enjoy that great place. It was open.
So your audio is cutting out. I wonder if you killed your video for a bit, that would help.
Early in the 2000s. Okay.
One chocolate glazed donut. And
we can also hear the order that's happening.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay now?
You sound fine.
I'm sorry. So I'm actually, you asked what I'm doing now. I am the communications director for Illinois State Controller Susana Mendoza, and we're just launching a 5-day tour of the state here, heading down to Springfield, then Carbondale, and so I'm in a car full of people. I'll try and do my best to keep this the conversation going here.
All right. So you're a state employee in Illinois, and we're going to bring it home to the Florida connection on this whole story later on, and to the peace process as we go along. But I'm going to try to kind of go step by step here in this really complicated but interesting story. So let's set the scene for people here in Florida by just reminding about the Troubles in Ireland. Why was there violence in Ireland and elsewhere before the 1998 Good Friday Agreement?
There's been various kinds of troubles for 800 years in Ireland. Britain took over Ireland for a millennia, and the Irish fought their way to an independence early in the 19th century, but not for the 6 northeasternmost counties where there was a majority of folks that wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. There were overlays with religion. This was a Catholic versus Protestant, but it was much more about nationality, and do you consider yourself Irish or you consider yourself Briton? And that really flared up in the late 60s when the Northern Irish Catholics trying to get their rights, use the civil rights methods of the American civil rights marchers in the late 60s and started protests in Northern Ireland. And it just, the other side didn't want that and came back with violence, and the British Army was brought in to try and keep peace, and ended up probably causing as many problems as they solved. And it just became a bloody mess for a few decades. In the peace process sort of emerged the IRA that was fighting, the guerrilla group fighting for the rights of the Northern Irish Catholics. Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, some of the leaders of the Sinn Féin political party, which was allied with the IRA, started this peace process where they say, hey, let's try laying down the arms and negotiating, see if we can come to a peace where if a majority of people in Northern Ireland vote to join the Republic of Ireland, they could. Majority want to stay with the United Kingdom, they can stay with the United Kingdom. And Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness were able to bring along most of their followers into the on board of the peace process. But there were the so-called hard men that wanted to keep planting bombs. They they formed these splinter groups called the Real IRA or Continuity IRA. And those are the groups that most concerned the British government and the U.S. government, which was trying to remain allies with Britain. And those were the groups that recruited this Chicago trucker, Dave Rupert, to try and help them solve the problem.
And we'll get some more about Dave Rupert and what happened after 1998. We'll get much more into that a little bit later. So in August of Good Friday of 1998 is when this peace process was signed, and it was a historic day. I remember watching it live. I was a high school teacher at the time, and so I had my students watch it live on CNN or whatever the channel it was that we were getting it on, and it was just a very historic day in Good Friday of 1998. But then just months later, these splinter groups, these hard men that you're talking about, committed another act of violence, and it was uncertain whether the peace process would continue. What happened in August of 1998?
So the Real IRA, working with the Continuity IRA, set off a bomb in the town of Omagh, Northern Ireland, that killed 31 people, including a woman who was pregnant with unborn twins. It was the single biggest atrocity of the Troubles, and it started in the late 60s and carried on through the 90s. And this is right after the voters on both sides of the border, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, Catholics and Protestants, all voted to go ahead with the peace process. And these were the folks that wanted to keep the arms struggle going up. So it really, it just devastated everyone. There were like 220 people, that were injured, a lot of them severely. It really mobilized public opinion against these violent paramilitary groups and towards moving forward with the peace process.
All right, so that sets the scene of where we were in 1998, and let's bring it now to the Florida connection. There was a chance encounter in Pinellas County where this main character in the story that you're going to tell, which you mentioned just a moment ago, Dave Rupert, had a meeting at this bar. What's the bar? And actually, before we even get to the bar, tell us a little bit about what we knew about Dave Rupert before he even arrived at the beaches of Pinellas County.
So Dave is kind of an intriguing character. He was a trucker, small-time truck company owner who had come from the very northern part of New York by the Canadian border, was doing business in Florida, running a trucking company there. He had been through a couple of marriages, a couple of bankruptcies, fancied himself a bit of an entrepreneur. So he starts going to the Harp and Thistle because he hears this beautiful Irish music coming from there. There used to be a husband and wife team, Guinness, the duo that played there. She had a wonderful voice. Laura Farrell, her husband Jim Farrell, was a talented musician. So Dave hears this music, and it reminds him of the bluegrass that he had grown up with in northern New York. And he starts going there. And then one night, he sees this beautiful redhead who he'd like to meet. And so he asks the bartender, "Hey, can you introduce me?" And he introduces Dave to this woman, Linda Vaughn. Linda Vaughn is a high-powered Tallahassee lobbyist. She's the reason you can't smoke indoors in Florida. She was at the time the campaign manager for Paul Tsongas, who was running for president against Bill Clinton in the 92 primary in Florida. So they get to talking, and Dave has been to Ireland once or twice. Now here's the part of the intriguing part of why you wouldn't expect that Dave Rupert would be a successful spy who'd infiltrate the Real IRA is he's not Irish. He doesn't have any connection to Ireland. He's a Protestant from upstate New York. We got a great story where he was having a medical issue. He was in a coma, and he comes to at this hospital in Syracuse, and it's St. Patrick's Day, and they've got all the beds, with the green bunting on them for St. Patrick's Day, and he writes a note because he can't talk, saying, "Get this damn green bunting off my bed. I'm not Irish." So he's a very unlikely character. But he had been to Ireland with a previous girlfriend a couple of times and really liked it. It reminded him, the west coast of Ireland, of the slow pace of life that he had in his childhood in upstate New York. And so he and Linda get to talking about Ireland, and they start bonding over that. She was very much into the Irish cause. So she's a lobbyist in Tallahassee. She had sort of single-handedly passed the McBride Principles in Tallahassee, which says that Florida's businesses that want to do state business with the state of Florida have to sign on to the McBride Principles, which says that if they do business in Northern Ireland, they can't discriminate against Catholics up there. They can't, a lot of the business in Northern Ireland, the way they would perpetuate the two-tiered system up there, even if they don't ask you what religion you are, they can say, well, what school did you go to? And by that means it was the same folks, the Protestants that had all the best paying jobs up there would hold on to them forever. And this was an attempt to break that. A lot of states passed these McBride Principles throughout the United States, especially in states that had sizable Irish populations. And so she was sort of the spearhead of that. But she'd also been going over to Ireland, working with these groups that supported the IRA. And she spoke at rallies. Is sometimes the only American speaking at these rallies in Ireland. She would go visit the IRA members who were in prison, and they would have little communication from home. So, like, the families of these prisoners would write out messages, and they'd wrap them up in a little piece of tinfoil. She would put the tinfoil in her mouth. She would go meet the prisoners, give them a kiss, pass this message, a kiss. So she was deeply involved in the cause, and she and Dave Rupert start dating. It's the Harp and Thistle, as we talked about before, beautiful pub on St. Pete Beach that unfortunately closed years ago. Great Irish music. They start dating, both in the Tampa area and in Tallahassee, and she brings him over to Ireland, and they're in pubs where her friends are running the pubs, and these friends of hers are involved in the IRA. And they start educating David about 800 years of British oppression. Here's how the British have oppressed the Irish for the last 800 years. So they're trying to school him. And he's interested in history, so he's listening. He's not a partisan. He doesn't really have a dog in the fight. He's not Irish. But he finds this all very interesting. And one day in one of the pubs, they're having this conversation where the pub owners are talking about their frustrations in not getting the British out of Northern Ireland. And Dave says, well, it's like with Vietnam. You're just not sending enough body bags home. That's what turned the war in Vietnam. You need to send more body bags home to Britain. And he wasn't saying it so much to advocate for that as just sort of making an observation. But instantly, he's a local hero. They're like, oh, he's one of our guys. And so they start to see him as a fellow fighter in the struggle against British oppression.
Well, let me introduce our guests again. We're speaking with Abdon Polish, who is a staff writer for the Tampa Tribune and other outlets. We're speaking about how this chance encounter at a Pinellas County beach bar is connected to the enduring peace in Ireland. I'm Sean Canan. This is Tuesday Cafe, broadcasting from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. And the two characters we have right now, we have Dave Rupert, who is a trucker from upstate New York, who at this St. Pete beach bar met Linda Vaughn, who is a high-powered Tallahassee lobbyist. As our guest Abdon just mentioned, she is the reason that you can't smoke indoors in Florida. And she also was a very strong advocate for Irish republicanism, which is having all of Ireland independent. And she has introduced Dave Rupert to these other like-minded people in Ireland, and he has gained their confidence, especially through this comment that Abdon has just told us about body bags, which, as you mentioned, Abdon, is kind of just an off-the-cuff remark, not so much necessarily what his actual, his thoughts were about what would actually happen. He just kind of mentioned that would get a lot of attention. You mentioned that Linda Vaughn was a lobbyist here in Florida, but she was also a lobbyist for NORAID. What is NORAID?
NORAID, Irish Northern Aid, is an American group that supports, Irish independence from Britain, the reunification of Ireland as a republic free of British influence. Now, they raise money here that they say goes to support the families of the Irish prisoners, the IRA members that are in prison for fighting against Britain. The U.S. and British governments and the Irish governments have accused NORAID over the years of actually funding, the armed struggle itself. NORAID has always denied that. NORAID has sort of waned in influence over the years. When Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams, the leaders of Sinn Féin, brought much of the IRA into the political process. And Sinn Féin grew as a party in Ireland, now one of the largest parties in Ireland. There was a similar schism here in the United States between what used to be NORAID, and a lot of them became then the Friends of Sinn Féin, right, raising money for Sinn Féin. But those Americans, Irish Americans who still wanted to support the military cause, then splintered off into other groups and became the Irish Freedom Committee, the Friends of Irish Freedom. And
Yeah, and Linda Vaughn, as you were mentioning, introduced Dave Rupert to a lot of these people who are sympathetic with violence, the use of violence to end the occupation, the English occupation of Ireland. And a lot of these people owned pubs. That just happened to be what a lot of the leaders did. And so she took him to those pubs, and he became friendly with these pub owners. And what can you tell us about some of these pub owners?
So Joe O'Neill was a pub owner in Bundoran, County Donegal, Ireland. A long, old veteran of the Irish Republican cause. He was an elected town councillor, a member of a group called Republican Sinn Féin, which had broken off from Sinn Féin because they thought Sinn Féin was too soft. They weren't fighting the British hard enough. And he was also an auctioneer and a real estate agent. So Dave gets to be friends with Joe and starts, just hanging out with him. Even after Dave and Linda Vaughn would break up, he would still come visit Ireland and go to Joe O'Neill's pub and hang with Joe. And similar in the town of Sligo, Vincey Conley owned a pub there. And Vincey was another, politically active guy. He was an elected town councillor in the Sinn Féin party in Sligo. Now, Linda Vaughn had set up Sligo as a sister city of Tallahassee. So she would go back and forth to Sligo and bring delegations from Florida there. And she would speak at the pro-IRA rallies in Sligo and in Bundoran. So one day, Dave is... It happened a couple of times. He was at Vincey Murray's pub in Sligo, and they step out onto the street, and a police car goes by. In Ireland, they call the police the Garda Síochána, the guards. And Vincey Murray says to Dave Rupert, "They just got your picture there," and because they're taking pictures of IRA activists, and Dave doesn't think much of it. And it's only a year or so later when he's back in at his truck office, which is now in Chicago, and a man comes in here. He says he's with the FBI, Agent Ed Buckley. And Dave starts worrying, oh no, what does he hear about? Is it because of that $750,000 in taxes I never paid when that one business went south? Is it some other shady deal he did through his career? Dave's had a number of careers he's tried and failed at over the years. And then Ed Buckley, the agent, slaps down photos of him and Vincey Murray, him and Joe O'Neill, and says, "What are you doing hanging out with these guys?" And Dave Rupert is relieved. He's like, "Oh, is that all?" Because he knows that he hasn't taken part in any IRA activities. He hasn't done anything wrong there. So he says, "Oh, these are just drinking buddies." And Ed Buckley says, "You know what they do?" He says, "Oh, yeah, they run pubs." "No, you know what they do?" "Yeah, they're town councilors." "No, you know what they do?" "Yeah, I know they're in the IRA." So Buckley says, "How would you like to go to work for us spying on them?" And Buckley says, Dave Rupert says, "Let me think about it." And Buckley gives him his card. And the next time Dave's back in Ireland, he's hanging out with Joe O'Neill, still thinking about Buckley's offer to go to work spying on Joe O'Neill and Vincey Murray. And Joe O'Neill drives him to Dublin to a meeting of his political party, the Republican Sinn Féin, and they're driving back. And Joe has some business, probably an IRA meeting, but he's not telling Dave that much detail yet. So he says, "I need to leave you at the hotel here while I go to a meeting for just, for an hour or two." And so as Dave is alone at the hotel, he starts to worry, what if they found me out? Because he finds Ed Buckley's card in his pocket. He says, what if they find me with this? Are they going to kill me? Yes. And so Dave decides to eat the card. He tears the card in little pieces and eats it. And he decides, yeah, I'm going to go to work as a spy. So this begins his unlikely career as an international spy for the FBI, eventually working with Britain's MI5, just gathering information on these IRA supporting groups. Joe O'Neill's group. Joe is affiliated with, he's in the Republican Sinn Féin. He'll come to find out that Joe is affiliated with the Continuity IRA, one of the splinter groups that is broken off from the IRA when the IRA members, sign on to the peace process. And eventually, Dave talks the FBI into funding a pub in Ireland. The FBI gives him money to lease a pub in Northern Ireland. Joe O'Neill is an auctioneer, so he has Joe set him up with a place. He's a real estate agent, basically, in Ireland. And so he sets him up with this dingy old bar that hasn't, it's a bit of a dump, a bit of a kip, as they call it in Ireland. And Dave Rupert and his wife Maureen move over there and start scrubbing the place back to life. And they open a pub on the IRA on the FBI's dime in this town in Northern Ireland. That's right on the border. It's a town in Ireland on the border of Northern Ireland, where a lot of IRA supporters hang out. IRA supporters from the Northern Ireland town of Dungannon come here and vacate behind the.
Something is happening to your audio connection. Not sure what that is. Are you still able to hear us?
I hear you fine. Can
okay.
You hear me right now?
It has cleared up.
Okay.
So yeah, you can continue from the pub on the border there.
Sorry about that. So they start running the pub, and it becomes very popular. They have a lot of these IRA supporters that rent caravans, basically trailers out behind the pub. And it's right on the Irish on the Irish coast. It's beautiful. The town of Tullahan, a little part of the county Leitrim where it touches the Atlantic Ocean there. And it's a spy story. Dave is working as a spy, but it's so unlike, it's not a James Bond movie. You never see James Bond like swabbing down the floor, scrubbing vomit off of a floor, changing out Guinness kegs. Dave has all sorts of problems because the previous owner had not paid his bills. You can't run a pub in rural Ireland without Guinness. And so Dave has to start resorting to, buying pubs out buying cases of
Kegs.
Kegs, thank you. Kegs of Guinness from the back door of a pub in Northern Ireland. You're not supposed to smuggle things across the border there, but it happens all the time. And then he can't return them there. And so he tells Joe O'Neill about his problem about, I got these Guinness kegs, I can't return them. And Joe O'Neill says, hey, that's wonderful, because Guinness kegs make great bombs. And Dave's like, oh no, what am I getting myself into? And so he starts taking down the serial numbers of the Guinness kegs in case, Joe O'Neill might use them for bombs. There's no evidence we found that any of the Guinness kegs were used for bombs. But Dave is now into this. This is exactly what the FBI and Britain's MI5 had wanted, for him to keep an eye on these folks and see what trouble they were going to get into. They never had much expectation of how high Dave might be able to go, how successful he might be, given the limitations that he is. Dave is a physically imposing individual. He is 6'7" tall, 300 pounds. He stands out in a crowd. He's a Protestant. As a Protestant, he stands out amongst all these IRA supporters that he's hanging out with. And yet, they really don't see it coming that he's a spy for the FBI and the MI5. He's got a very disarming way about him. He's very folksy and personable and tells a good story. And as a trucker, he's able to convince a lot of these IRA folks who spend their life smuggling things back and forth across the Northern Ireland border that he was a smuggler too, that he used to smuggle weed back and forth across the Canadian and Mexican borders in his trucks. He didn't really, but he knew how to talk about it in such a way that he convinced them that he was a fellow, borderline living on the border of the law kind of guy.
And speaking of smuggling, sorry to pause the interview for a second. Let me remind people that I'm speaking with Abdon Polish, who's a staff writer for the Tampa Tribune and other outlets, and we're speaking about how a chance encounter at a Pinellas County beach bar is connected to enduring peace in Ireland. I'm Sean Canan. This is Tuesday Cafe. We're broadcasting from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. And on that note, we'll come back to this pub on the border between Ireland and the north of Ireland in just a moment, but I want to bring it back to Florida for just a second, because you interviewed Dave Rupert, and you recorded these interviews on the Pinellas County beaches in these beach bars, and here's one of the segments where he was talking about his dreams, I guess, of smuggling, of becoming a smuggler, even though, as you pointed out, he's never really been a smuggler. He just was kind of thinking about it and play acting. But here's one of the conversations that you had with Dave Rupert.
I've always had a fascination with hovercrafts. And I'm watching the gambling ships go in and out of John's Pass. And they go out. John's Pass is like Treasure Island. And I'd watch them go out. I thought, well, gee, if they just stayed out there and stayed out past the 12-mile limit and run taxis in and out, then and never came to U.S. port, then they're not subject to U.S. law.
All right, so that's Dave Rupert, who's a trucker, and now he owns this pub, or he was leasing this pub in Ireland because the FBI had recruited him to spy on Irish Republicans. And you were interviewing, Abdon Polish was interviewing Dave Rupert after the fact here, but just kind of reminiscing about his days of dreaming about becoming a smuggler. So what can you tell us about that interview, where it was, and why you were talking with him?
And I won't disclose where the interviews took place, because Dave Rupert still has to live sort of off the grid to this day. You know, with all the damage that he's done to these IRA splinter groups, he has to be very careful. So when all this became public in the early 2000s, we started having these interviews with Dave where he told us his whole crazy, unlikely story of his success as an international spy. And you can listen to all these tapes now on our podcast called The Rebel Kind. We chose that name, The Rebel Kind, because that was Dave's yearbook inscription up in upstate New York. He was a bit of a rebel himself, but he's infiltrating these rebel groups, the Irish rebels who rebel against the British occupation, as they see it, of Northern Ireland. So it works on a couple different levels there. The Hollywood outfit that approached us about this, Entropy Media, we're the second in their series, so it's the Underbelly series. So just go on wherever you listen to your finer podcast, Apple or Spotify, look for Underbelly: The Rebel Kind, and we've got 12 episodes, which are, I don't know how much you had a chance to listen, Sean, but they're really fun. We have a lot of great music. I got Jim and Laura Farrell from Guinness, the duo. They used to play at the Harp and Thistle. We've got the Drovers, a great Irish folk band in Chicago. We've got interviews with a lot of interesting people, academics. I talked to a lot of IRA guys. Believe it or not, the IRA guys are not really keen on me having, playing the interviews with them on the air.
Shocker.
So some of that just informs these episodes. But we have to pack 800 years of British oppression of the Irish into just 12 episodes. And then the Omagh series, the Omagh episode is really heartbreaking when we hear from the people who lost loved ones in that bombing that really did solidify public opinion in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in favor of going forward the peace process and abandoning these paramilitary groups. So where we're at with Dave when he's this pub, it's a financial disaster. He's not making much money off the pub, but he is convincing a lot of these IRA supporters that he's with them, that he's part of their cause. And so he is making this unlikely ascent up in the ranks of the IRA splinter groups that worry the British and Irish and Northern Irish governments, and American governments about what's going on. They never really thought he would make it all the way up to Mickey McKevitt, the head of the real IRA, the most dangerous of all the splinter groups. And yet he does. Word of Rupert's success with the bar, and also the fact that he's seen as a bit of a money man. all his trips back and forth to Ireland are paid for by the FBI, but he passes himself off as a wealthy American businessman. And in classic Chicago fashion, he makes himself the bagman. You've got these American support groups for the IRA that raise money in Chicago, Boston, New York. And he says, "Oh, I'm going over to Ireland. I'll take the money over." So they're raising the money in the U.S. and he's bringing the money over to Ireland. And when you show up in Ireland with envelopes full of cash, people are happy to see you. So Mickey McCavitt hears word of this American supporter of the IRA cause that's been active on the west coast of Ireland, and he says, "I'd like to meet this guy." And so you remember that Seinfeld episode about the switch, where Jerry's trying to switch from the one roommate to the other in terms of dating, and is that going to work? Dave has to pull off a very careful switch between the continuity IRA that he's been involved with Joe O'Neill over in Bundoran, and now go over to the real IRA with Mickey McCavitt. And he's able to do this, and then he has to bring the U.S. support groups, similarly, who have been supporting the continuity IRA, to try and bring them over to the real IRA so that he can move up the ranks of the real IRA, which he does, and eventually is able to bring the whole operation down. And much to the shock and surprise of the British MI5 and American FBI agents that are working with him, and never thought he'd have the kind of success he had.
So they brought a trial against Mickey McCavitt, and the main witness was Dave Rupert.
Yes, so the trial takes place in 2003, and with Rupert as the main witness, and he's just sort of recounting all the time that he spent with McCavitt and everything McCavitt's been doing. McCavitt, in describing the Omaha bombing, said, "Well, we were about 20% responsible for it. We built the bomb, we stole the car, and then we turned that all over to Continuity IRA, who was 80% responsible." Now, the real IRA, shortly after the Omaha bomb happened, they put out a news release claiming responsibility. Continuity IRA never did. So who's to say which group, did more? But the real IRA did admit responsibility.
And before we go too much further, I want to reiterate the fact that these groups, the real IRA, the continuity IRA, these are splinter groups off of what was called the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, that the political wing was Sinn Féin, which was in part of the peace process. So these groups with longer names, Continuity IRA, Real IRA, are no longer affiliated with the peace process. They're still trying to use violence as a means to get an end to the British occupation after the 1998 Good Friday Accords.
We oppose the peace process. They're literally trying to blow it up. They see the peace process as if you're just going to allow all of us to participate in a British-occupied state of Northern Ireland, which in mind should not exist. There's a capitulation. And that's sort of the history of Irish republicanism over the years, is groups that whenever they
You might be in an area that has not as great mobile service right now because you're breaking up. Let me play another clip while you maybe get to a better area. This clip is also from the recordings that our guest Abdon Polish made with Dave Rupert, who is recruited by the FBI to spy on Irish Republican groups. And he's talking about the ability to find black money, what he calls black money, in Florida. This is Tuesday Cafe, broadcasting from WMNF.
There's a lot of black money in Florida. So I thought, well, if we had a Bank of Panama out on a ship, they can take it out there, and there's an attorney involved. I figured keep it all legal, you keep everything legal, as far as. And then we needed somebody in the gambling business. So I got a hold of a guy in Syracuse in the trucking business, and I knew that this guy had a friend by the name of who I assume had connections to the mob, but he knew about the gambling business. So he came down. So, I went to Diego's house, great big palace up on Bel Air Bluffs. And so me and a guy in Diego go out to dinner at Leverock's, which is on St. Pete Beach. Yeah, they get drunk. And there was neither one of them are good drunks. And the guys talking about shoving hot pokers up people's butts to maintain control. And Diego's talking about just having executed. And I'm just like dying of embarrassment.
Well, that is an interview that our guest Abdon Palish had with Dave Rupert, who was in Florida and in the time that he was describing, and eventually was recruited by the FBI to go to Ireland to spy on some violent activities against the occupation of Ireland by the British. And so, Abdon, do we have you back?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me, right?
You sound great. And so, take it from there. We were talking about this trial of Mickey McKevitt, who was one of the leaders of the real IRA, and he was put on trial for this act of terrorism.
And on the stand, Dave describes, how he met Linda Vaughn in the Harp Thistle in St. Pete Beach, and she introduced him to these IRA-owning pub owners, and that's how he got into it. And he gives the whole story of how Mickey McKevitt was directing him to go to the U.S. and try to get all these groups to join the real IRA.
So with Rupert's testimony, McKevitt was sentenced to 20 years?
He's sentenced to 20 years in prison. Can we shut off this?
This is WMNF Tampa.
And he ends up serving about 12 before he gets sick, and he's released from prison, and he dies in 2021. And this really sort of decapitates the whole real IRA. It without its leader and with public opinion firmly against it, it's pretty much over. And the peace process has been able to move forward. So when President Biden goes to Belfast last year to celebrate 25 years of peace, he doesn't mention Dave Rupert by name, but without Dave Rupert's extraordinary success here and being able to take out the real IRA that was literally trying to blow up the peace process, we might not be celebrating decades of peace in Northern Ireland.
And all that got started, as you write in the Florida Bulldog, because of this chance encounter with Linda Vaughn, this Florida lobbyist, in a Pinellas County beach bar, the Harp and Thistle.
Yeah. It's a crazy story, so improbable and so unlikely. But it happened, and like I said, you listen to the whole story. It got 12 episodes. The second episode is the one that focuses on his time in Florida. But just look up Underbelly, the Rebel Kind. While he's on the stand in Dublin, in McKevitt's trial, he's talking about the other missions that Mickey McKevitt sent him on. For instance, he sent him to El Paso, Texas, because Mickey McKevitt was thinking of smuggling arms out of the U.S. across the Texas border into Mexico and then up to Ireland, or smuggling McKevitt himself across the border into the U.S., even though McKevitt was on the FBI watch list. And they had actually moved in a sharpshooter, a guy who McKevitt told Rupert, this guy is a good trigger man. He's the guy they'd have in mind if they ever wanted to take out a big target like then Prime Minister Tony Blair. And because Rupert had moved up to be such a trusted assistant of McKevitt, he's bringing the money. Dave's got some skills in computers, and he's doing Mickey's computers for him. He basically makes him his deputy in the U.S., and he says, have this assassin, James Smith, have him move from Boston down to El Paso. So he's going to oversee our weapons moving, across the Texas-Mexico border. And so Rupert goes down there to scout the border, and he's on the phone with James Smith, the assassin, who says, you know what? He doesn't like that plan because he's fallen in love and he wants to stay there in Boston with his girlfriend. Yeah. And Rupert's thinking to himself, wait a minute, how am I going to tell the leader of the real IRA that his top assassin has refused an order to move from Boston to El Paso because he's in love? the frustrations of trying to be, a spy posing as an IRA supporter who's a top aide now to the head of this splinter group, um, a position that Rupert really never would have seen himself in growing up in upstate New York, wearing orange on St. Patrick's Day and like have an antagonistic relationship toward the Irish.
And his meeting in Pinellas County with the lobbyist from Florida, Linda Vaughn, before she died, she went to a rally in Ireland and she ran into some of her old friends. What was their reaction to her after this whole FBI spy scene?
So Linda, back when she's dating Dave and she's just bringing her latest boyfriend over to meet these pub owners, she was a true believer in the Irish cause fighting against the British. She wouldn't have been particularly allied with, the splinter groups. The splintering hadn't happened yet when she was still going there and doing that. But she's the one that introduced him to Dave. And years later, when it came out that Dave was a spy, that really killed her. She felt like she had betrayed her friends. So when the FBI comes knocking at her door in Tallahassee saying, "We'd like you to testify to vouch for Rupert," she sends him away. She's not going to cooperate with the FBI. She doesn't want any part of that. So I think it was in 2015, she goes back to, or maybe a little earlier than that, she goes to Bundoran to the last rally she attended. And there's Joe O'Neill, the pub owner that she had introduced Dave to. And she says, "Joe, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Linda Vaughn." And he says, "Oh, I remember you. You're the one that introduced that traitor into our midst." And that really devastated her because she had worked so hard for so many years doing what she thought was good for the cause that she believed in, of getting the British out of Northern Ireland. Her husband, Kevin Mangan, they spent the last 20 years together, after she had broken up with Dave. He said, for all the good that she's done, the head of the Wolf Tones, an Irish band named for a revolutionary wolf tone, Derek Wakefield. He gave her the Sean McBride Award for her work passing the Sean McBride principles in Tallahassee. Kevin says that should be her legacy, not the fact that she inadvertently, brought this Dave Rupert into the midst of what was going on there in Northern Ireland. Now, it kind of depends on your opinion of whether you think what Dave did was good or bad. I've grown up Irish in Chicago, and I'm not ordinarily in the habit of rooting for moles who work with the Brits against our people. But in this case, Rupert was arguably on the right side of history. You had all the Protestants and Catholics, the voters north and south of the border, overwhelmingly voting to go forward with a peace process, to lay down their arms, and to try and do this by a vote. If we have more majority of people that vote in Northern Ireland to rejoin the Republic of Ireland, that's what we'll do. If we have a majority of people voting to stay part of the UK, that's what we'll do. And here's this small splinter group that wants to keep setting off bombs that just that so affected civilians in a much greater proportion often than the police or the soldiers who were supposed to be the targets. Rupert was probably on the right side here. I'd have the arguments with the folks that he infiltrated. I happen to know a lot of these folks in Chicago that were involved in the American fundraising groups for the IRA that Rupert infiltrated here in Chicago. And I'd ask them, listen, if everyone there in Northern Ireland want the peace process, they want this to work, why do you here in Chicago, who are generations removed, think that you know better than people who live there? They say, oh, they've been bamboozled, they've been misled. But I'm inclined to trust the people that live there to know what's best for Northern Ireland.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on WMNF's Tuesday Cafe today, Abdon.
Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
I really appreciate you coming on. Abdon Palish was a staff writer for the Tampa Tribune and for other outlets, and he has produced the Underbelly podcast, The Rebel Kind, this season of the podcast about the enduring peace in Ireland that might have a connection, that does have a connection here to the beaches of Pinellas County. I'm Sean Canan. This is Tuesday Cafe. We're broadcasting from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. And if you're listening here live on the 11th of June and you'd like to make a comment, you can give us a call at 813-239-9663. You can also email dj@wmnf.org, or you can text us at 813-433-0885. I want to thank Joe, who wrote in earlier and said that he's saying that it's a really interesting interview today. Thanks for doing it, and he would love more of this kind of stuff. So thank you for that feedback, Joe. Really appreciate those words. We're going to turn now, though, to Gaza. Yesterday, I spoke with a man in Al Zawaida. That's in the central Gaza Strip. So that's the same part of the region of the Strip that the Nuseirat refugee camp is in. That's where at least 274 Palestinians, including dozens of children, were killed, and hundreds more were wounded over the weekend in that Israeli raid that rescued 4 hostages held by Hamas. So the man we're going to hear from now, his name is Sleiman Ramadan Shnira, and he's there in Gaza with his 2 sons, but his wife and 2 daughters evacuated to Cairo, Egypt. And one of his teenage daughters is very sick. His hope is that they can all be reunited. So here's about a 3.5-minute interview I did yesterday with Sleiman Shnira about his life in the Gaza Strip. His English is not his first language, so you might have to listen pretty closely, but I hope that you enjoy hearing how he's describing the situation there.
My family, my wife and 2 daughters in Cairo now, but I am here from 2 children, Ramadan and Ahmad, with Zawaida. Near Nuseirat, when yesterday to bombing.
And is that the Israeli operation where they rescued some of the hostages, but then a lot of Palestinians were killed? What did you see?
I see. We want peace, and we want this war is finishing.
Tell me about your family and what you're trying to do as far as getting them out of the Middle East.
My family, I told you, I took you 2 daughters and my wife in Cairo now. They evacuate from 2 months in Cairo. Now I am here for 2 children, Ramadan and Ahmad. We want this war is finishing and this killing stop. It's too difficult. We are here is too difficult life. Everything is difficult, from water, from eat, from medicine, everything. It's too difficult.
And you're trying to get your wife out of Egypt?
Yes, my wife and 2 daughters. My daughter, I have 1 daughter, Rama. It's sick now. She is don't move, don't walk, don't hear, don't talk anything. It's sick. She is 15 years old in Cairo now. When they go from Gaza, she is go to hospital in Cairo. 14 day in hospital. Now, thanks God, it's good.
How can people find out more about your sick daughter and your wife in Egypt and helping to get them out?
Maybe many people or a lot of people help us for in Cairo. Maybe we know a lot of people help us there.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you want the listeners in the USA to know about what's happening in Gaza?
In Gaza, it's too difficult life. every people in Gaza is war, take everything. We want to stop this war. We want this and stop killed for all people.
All right, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's Sulaiman Ramadan Shrinra, who is in the central Gaza Strip with his two sons, but his wife and his two daughters evacuated to Cairo. One of his teenage daughters is very sick, and he hopes that they can all be reunited. You can find out more on our website. It's WMNF.org. That story is going to be published in about 2 minutes or so on our website, so you can check it out there. And we're going to end the show today by talking quickly about education in Florida. Yesterday, Governor DeSantis announced that he plans to support a $1 billion budget allocation to raise teacher pay. WFSU's Tristan Wood has this quick report. It comes as average teacher pay in Florida ranks second to the last in the nation. And after we hear this report from the governor, we'll also hear a little bit more from the FEA, the largest teachers union in the state.
At a press conference in Hialeah, DeSantis touted his administration's support of teacher pay.
So since 2019 to the present, we've had by far the biggest increase in teacher compensation that has ever happened in the history of the state of Florida. And that's something that the legislature has worked with us on.
The governor also took the opportunity to attack teachers' unions in Florida, which are often critical of the governor and support Democratic candidates. The Republican-controlled legislature has targeted unions with legislation, including a bill that prohibits them from deducting union dues from paychecks.
These school unions have become ultra partisan. They've been trying to impose left-wing ideology. And the thing is, it's like, wait a minute, are you representing teachers to get better pay and benefits? Or are you trying to push a political agenda? And unfortunately, so much of it has been about pushing a political agenda.
The Florida Education Association, the state's largest teacher union, held its own press conference to respond to DeSantis' remarks. Andrew Spar, the union's president, says the increase will still leave Florida teachers among the lowest paid in the country.
That the facts that we keep dealing with here in Florida don't match his narrative, and he wants to continue to repeat that narrative that just isn't true. The reality of it is Florida is facing the worst teacher and staff shortage we have ever seen.
The average teacher salary in Florida is about $53,000. That's near the average salary for all workers in Florida. I'm Tristan Wood.
Well, thank you for that report from Tristan Wood in WFSU. Let's hear a little bit more from that. The state's largest teachers union, the FEA, President Andrew Spar was responding to the governor's press release yesterday, a press conference that is yesterday, with his press conference of his own. We'll only have time to hear about a minute of it, but let's hear what he has to say.
Educators every day sacrifice so much to make sure that their kids, as they call them, their students, have what they need to succeed. And what we've seen from this administration over a period of time is a constant deflection of attention. It's ironic that here we are with the governor not even signing the budget for the 24-25 school year, which begins in less than a month. That budget year begins in less than a month. That he's already talking about the budget he wants to propose for the 25-26 school year. Why now? Is it because it turns out that the facts that we keep dealing with here in Florida don't match his narrative, and he wants to continue to repeat that narrative that just isn't true? The reality of it is Florida is facing the worst teacher and staff shortage we have ever seen, leading the nation in the number of teacher and staff vacancies we have in our public schools.
Well, that is the state's largest teachers union president, Andrew Spar, president of the FEA, and he was responding to Governor Ron DeSantis. You have been listening to Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan, News and Public Affairs Director at WMNF Tampa. Next week on Tuesday Cafe, we're going to hear the latest about a proposed development around the stadium, the Rays Stadium in St. Petersburg. We'll also get an update on Pride Month from Equality Florida. During this time slot tomorrow, Shelley will host Midpoint at 10 o'clock on Wednesday. Next up is Wavemakers with Janet and Tom Scherberger, and their Wavemaker today is Robert Dubois, a Tampa man who spent 37 years in prison for a murder he did not commit. They'll also speak with the Tampa Bay Times reporters who are chronicling his story. Then, coming up at noon is Wide Awake America with Nadine Smith. Her guest will be Yale professor Marcy Shore, author of The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. This has been Tuesday Cafe, coming to you live on June 11th, 2024 from the studios of WMNF Tampa. I want to thank everyone who supported us during the recent WMNF Fund Drive. You can still donate and support this programming at WMNF.org. Thanks so much for listening and supporting community radio. WMNF